Hello again guys, it's me with another lame video for your anthology notes. Again, it's not ideal, it's rather monotonous and boring, me just having a conversation with myself, but it's important that you keep up to date with all the notes and things. Okay, so here we go. I'll just get this balanced. Apologies. Okay. So to begin with then, history, a deliberately sort of quite ambiguous title, could be about any of number of things, but actually, the context for this poem is important to understand. Although you're not marked on contextual links for this question, you can't really understand the full significance of this poem without considering the context. So he talks about that this is September 2001. Now, this is the month and the year that the Twin Towers in America were blown apart by terrorists. So this was the World Trade Center in America, in New York. So remember, called the Twin Towers because there were literally sort of two towers that were part of the World Trade Center, and an aeroplane flew into these Twin Towers, killing lots and lots of people. And it was really shocking because it was one of the sort of first mass terrorist incidents that had happened in the world so far, and it sort of quickly travelled around the globe. I actually remember being at school when this attack had happened. I remember one of my friends getting a text from her mum and telling her about it, and we were just really shocked by the images that her mum was kind of sending through. And again, it had that shocking appeal. And that essentially is what this poem is about, sort of what happens to us after an event like this. What do we think? Who are we? What is the point after an event like this? So the poem starts off, it says, in St Andrews, which is in Scotland, and it's on the southeast coast of Scotland. He starts off with today, which is perhaps a little bit confusing because he starts with history and then immediately juxtaposes this with the present moment, I suppose. He says, as we flew the kites, we know from reading the rest of the poem that this is the narrator and his son. Also this connection to the air, so how we flew the kites, so the kites flying through the same air, the aeroplanes travelled through to destroy the Twin Tower buildings. So there's this link, if you like, to the poems. He talks about the sand spinning off in ribbons along the beach. We get lots and lots of sibilance in this poem, and lots of language in the semantic field of the sea, because essentially he's standing on the beach contemplating his problems. So we get lots of sibilance mimicking the sound of the sea. So the sand is spinning off in ribbons along the beach. But the fact that it's fragmented, it's in ribbons, it's in sections, a little bit like how the buildings were fragmented, society, Burnside believed, was becoming fragmented. He talks about the gasoline smell that he can smell in the air. Now, is the gasoline from just, a factory or from a petrol station? Or is it actually the gasoline, the fuel in the air from the aeroplanes that he imagines he can smell all the way in Scotland across from New York? He talks about from Lucas, I don't know how you pronounce that, but this is an area again in southeast Scotland. But basically, he is standing across a bay. So we've got, say for example, excuse my poor drawing, but here would be St Andrews, and here would be Lucas, or however you pronounce it. And the fact is that this would be water, and this is part of Scotland, and he'd be standing on this beach looking across this way, and he imagines that he can smell the gasoline from this area coming across in the air. He then talks about the golf links. So it's gusting across the golf links, indicating, these are popular places to play golf, but perhaps punning on the word gulf, Gulf, suggesting a vast space, vast space in the sky, between the World Trade Center buildings. Is he talking about the vast space, from St Andrews to Lucas, or however you pronounce it? Or the disconnect that we have as people, the vast space beneath, between people in society, that we're disconnected. Again, a theme he picks up on later in the poem. He talks about how the tide is far out. Again, this sort of idea of distance is presented, this idea that something is not close but far away. He talks about the quail grey tide. Again, grey, kind of monotonous, pedestrian, boring, not particularly beautiful. He says people are jogging or stopping to watch as the warplanes cambered and turned in the morning light. So again, it's slightly ambiguous. These warplanes, are they planes in the UK? Because, when this event happened, the rest of the world sort of stood to attention and thought, okay, so if this has happened in America, where's the next attack going to be? And I remember at the time, the sort of panic really in Britain when they were considering, where could they strike next? What else could be done? So are these warplanes preparing for attack? It shows this uncertainty and the fact that they are preparing for something and they don't quite know what yet. But it's saying that they cambered, so they arched and they turned in the sky in the morning light. Is it that they're turning towards America or, popular tourist destinations like London that might be hit, or are they returning from there? We're not sure. Again, we've got this today opening a line, so we've got a bit of anaphora for repetition. We'll talk about the structure of this in more detail at the end, because it's quite a complex structure. He talks about with the news in my mind, again, the news perhaps being of the Twin Towers attack, and the muffled dread of what may come. So again, this dread, this anticipation, and not knowing. Muffled, suggesting that it's quiet. Again, this is quiet fear. No one sort of openly speaking about it. And I suppose, this poem, although Burnside couldn't have anticipated the current situation with the coronavirus, could we apply that to today and modern society? Because actually, there is this sort of muffled, this quiet panic, dread of something that's coming, and we can't quite communicate about it. All this idea of social isolation. Perhaps this is relevant to that. Because he says, muffled dread of what may come. We don't know. It's a time of uncertainty, much like the time was, in 2001 with the World Trade Center attacks. He says, I knelt down in the sand with Lucas. Now we imagine, obviously, Lucas is his son, speaker's son. And he said, gathering shells and pebbles, finding evidence of life in all this driftwork. So it seems that there's lots of, as he describes, driftwork, things that have just blown onto shore, random things maybe. But he's trying, he says, to find evidence of life, that there is something alive, that there is something left. Maybe he's talking about hope. He's also perhaps by this finding evidence of life. So all these random bits and pieces that have kind of drifted off, is he just trying to make sense of what's happened? So he's actually kneeling down, looking, sifting through shells, but metaphorically, is he actually trying to find a reason for what has happened, try and find some sort of sense in what has happened? He then goes on to list, we can't call it syndetic or asyndetic because it's a mixture of both. So we've got snail shells, shreds of razor fish, smudges of weed and flesh on tide-worn stone. So the sibilance here again is mimetic of the sea. But it also creates like a gusty feeling, almost of the wind blowing across the bay. The wind that's been blown across onto the beach. He then continues by saying, at times I think that what makes us who we are is neither kinship, which means like a blood relation, nor our given states, but something lost between the world we own and what we dream about behind the names on days like this. So he's trying to sort of make us consider really like who are we? What defines us, he says, what makes us is not where we've come from, nor, given our states, what we're actually doing right now. But he says the things that define us are the things, he says, which are lost between the world we own and what we dream about, behind the names on days like this. So he's getting us to consider, who we really are. And actually, it's on days like this, when he's heard this awful news, that actually he thinks this is who we really are. How we behave on days like this determines who we really are. Here we are. He says that our lines are raised in the wind. So again, a metaphor. He says that we are our lines are raised almost like the kite in the beginning of the poem. So you can talk about the kite metaphor. And that we are all essentially, putting ourselves out there like the same way that the kite is raised expectantly into the sky, hoping for a gust of wind to kind of carry it on, carry it forward, hoping for some sense of direction. He says our bodies are fixed and anchored to the shore. Now again, you could read this in two ways. One, that we're kind of trapped and that we're stuck. Or is it that he's suggesting this is our only sense of security in a world of uncertainty when we don't know what's happening? Actually, what can anchor us? What can bring us back down to earth, excuse the pun, is actually appreciating the earth and nature. Again, something that comes up throughout the whole poem. He then says, and though we are confined, again, sort of these claustrophobic verbs, perhaps, we are confined by property, so by material things. What tethers us, again, another constricting, pulling verb, tethers. What tethers us to gravity and light has most to do with distance and the shapes we find in water. Again, this is really ambiguous, but for me, my interpretation of this is that he's suggesting, what grounds us, what makes us feel confined and keeps us grounded is nature, because he says it's most to do with the distance and the shapes we find in water. So what we look for, what we find. He also talks about reading the book of Silt and Tides. Again, reading the book, a metaphor, but talking about how we read the earth, how we read nature. He then goes into detail about the sea and then talks about the beautiful colours of the rose or the petrol blue of jellyfish and sea anemone combining with the child's first nakedness. So again, although this might seem odd to us, I don't think he's intending to be funny. I think he actually means when a child is born, so their birth, he thinks that if we can see the beauty in nature and appreciate it for what it really is, he said it's almost like that moment when a child is born. It's that exciting. It's a defining moment, and it's natural beauty. So again, you could say that this is perhaps similar to the chainsaw versus the pampas grass because of the romantic beliefs. Remember, romantic with a capital R, meaning, man's connection with nature and the fact that we should go out and we should appreciate nature. The difference being is that John Burnside here doesn't seem to see God in nature like the traditional romantic writers did. He seems to see a sense of meaning, a sense of being grounded, a sense of purpose. So you could say, although some romantic ideas are put forward, actually some of them are not appropriate. Okay, next one. Okay, so he says, sometimes I'm dizzy with the fear of losing everything. So dizzy, like overwhelmed almost, this feeling of, I can't even comprehend what it would be like to lose everything. So like those people in the World Trade Center who lost everything that day, or whose family members have lost a mother, a brother, a sister, he can't contemplate that, particularly with his son Lucas beside him. He can't contemplate this. He then talks about the sea, the sky, all creatures, forest, estuaries. We trade so much to know the virtual. We scarcely register the drift and tug of other bodies. So again, imagery in the semantic field of the sea and the beach. So the drift and the tug, the sea and the sky. But again, he's using listing here to show how many beautiful things there are in the world. And again, you could say we've got a bit of sibilance here, losing everything, the sea, the sky, living creatures, forests, estuaries. Again, this idea that something is flowing like the sea, one onto the next. So again, he's highlighting here our disconnect with nature and the fact that we are now so interested in the virtual, so in technology and electronics, that actually we've forgotten how to read the tides of silt and, what does he say, tides of silt and tides. We've forgotten how to read that. Also, his use here of trade is perhaps not accidental. The fact that the World Trade Centers was destroyed, and the fact that he's used trade here, again, a reference to that. And again, all this sea imagery connects us to America. If you think about the oceans and the seas, the body of water that connects different parts of the world, and in the same way that these lines, we could say, although interrupted by caesura, perhaps sometimes ended with a bit of punctuation, actually we get a bit of enjambment as well, mimicking the flow, the ebb and the flow of the waves. So he says that we scarcely register, we scarcely acknowledge even the drift and tug of other bodies. We're so almost, is he suggesting, self-centered? That we can't help other people, that we can't know what they're feeling. He then says he can scarcely, so hardly, apprehend the moment as it happens. So he cannot begin to understand the moment as it happens. He says shifts of light and weather and the quiet local forms of history, the fish lodged in the tide beyond the sands. So lodged indicates like a feeling of trapped. Apologies if you can hear my daughter crying in the background. She's just throwing a tantrum. Okay, so lodged, trapped. It means in farming a crop that is flattened by wind or rain. So the long insomnia, it talks about of ornamental carp in public parks. So again, if you think about these carp that obviously often appear in parks or, country houses and their gardens, they're beautiful to look at. They're bright, vivid colours against the sort of dark pond. And he talks about their insomnia, the fact that they seemingly just go on and on and on, and they don't ever seem to sleep. They're constantly, or seemingly, on the move. But he describes them as captive. Again, are they trapped, or is it captive in the sense that we are held captivated by them and that they are bright? This sort of pleasant imagery could be a metaphor for hope. That actually, despite all of this confusion, despite all of this chaos, can we derive some sense of hope from all of this? He says, and hung on their own slow-burning, transitive gold. Transitive, so again, gold, a pleasant image, beautiful to look at, but transitive, indicating that it will fade. Is it because the movement of the fish, the sunlight catches the scales on their skin one moment, and then as they move on, it disappears? So is it this transitory, continuously moving, or is it that nothing beautiful can last? Which, as we know, is a common theme in literature. He says transitive, so like we said, could mean fading, because then he talks about jam jars of spawn, like frog spawn, and sticklebacks, so little river fish that you can find in the UK, or goldfish carried home from fairgrounds. So all these things perhaps that we used to do as young children. He then talks about the hum of the radio, but this is the problem. We've almost got some juxtaposition here of the seemingly natural imagery, goldfish, spawns, sticklebacks, and we've got these hints of, man-made things like jam jars and fairgrounds. But he says that the hum of the radio is the problem. And the radio here, again, represents technology, represents the fact that we have disconnected from nature. He says, how to be alive in all this gazed upon and cherished world and do no harm. So how can we live without, destroying or damaging the earth? Maybe alluding to sort of climate change. He talks about that the world is gazed upon, so admired maybe. Again, which is kind of shown by cherished. If you cherish something, you celebrate something. And he's suggesting that we should celebrate it. But how do we do no harm? And then he brings us back to the present moment. A toddler on the beach, so his son Lucas, sifting wood and dried weed from the sand and puzzled by the pattern on a shell. Puzzled indicates that maybe he's intrigued by it. He's trying to fathom out how that beautiful pattern got there. What does it mean? What's the point in it all? Something like that natural curiosity that perhaps we lose as we get older. He's sort of highlighting here the innocence and curiosity of children. And he says his parents on the dune slack, so on the banks of sand, with a kite plugged into the sky. So again, we get this almost cyclical nature to the poem, because it starts with the kite on the beach with his son, and then it ends with a kite on the beach with the son. However, it's almost this third person detachment here. So his parents, instead of me and my son Lucas, which it starts off with, his parents. So it's almost as if we have, I don't know how to describe it, almost we are zooming out of the picture. We are raising higher and higher in the sky like the kite, and we are kind of becoming detached from what is going on. Again, maybe highlighting our detachment from nature. Interesting, he uses this phrase, plugged into. Again, you think of electrical equipment, and it kind of alludes to the fact that we are always too plugged in, we're too focused on technology. But it's interesting here that he says he's plugged into the sky. So is it at this moment in history, in 2001, were we all plugged into the sky in the sense that we were watching the skies, waiting to see if a similar attack would occur, in our own home place? Shows perhaps this uncertainty. And he says all nerve and line, like nerve indicating bravery. We are like the kites now. We're waiting expectantly for a gust of wind to kind of direct us and tell us what to do. He says, and line patient, afraid, but still through everything, attentive to the irredeemable. Irredeemable just means to be kind of, something cannot be saved, or it cannot be made better again. So it's this idea that no matter what we do, how we wonder, what we think, we can't change those events in history. We can't change what happens. But what we can change maybe is our future. The fact that we can choose to reconnect with the earth. We can choose peace. It's easy in times like this, particularly now, again with the coronavirus thing. I know I said this before, but this poem really resonates, I think, with this. What we're all experiencing now is that it's easy in times like this to turn against each other. It's easy to, focus on the negatives and look at the ridiculous sort of mass buying of people in supermarkets, the actual physical fights breaking out in supermarkets over a bit of toilet roll. Or do we choose to concentrate on the positives? That we're lucky to have our family, we're lucky to have the sunshine, we're lucky for all of these reasons. And maybe we should actually appreciate what we have. And I think that's what he's suggesting in this poem. Okay, so structurally then, it is, like I said, a really complex structure, but a couple of things to note then. So it obviously is very irregular as a whole, so there's no specific verses. You could even use the word erratic to describe the structure. It's unpredictable. Again, perhaps this unpredictable structure shows the uncertainty of this time. The fact that there is no specific pattern, there is no rhyme, therefore reading the poem is quite hard because we can't anticipate or predict when a line is going to end, when a sentence is going to end. So therefore we also feel that level of uncertainty. This is written in free verse, and there's a mixture, like I said as we were going along, of enjambment, but also of frequent caesura, mimicking sort of this stopping, starting, where do we go, but also mimicking the movement of the waves, so the fact that the waves ebb and flow back and forth. And as you can see, like up the if you just look at the poem, we've got these lines on opposite sides of the page. So we could say that again, is this mimicking the movement, the flowing of the waves? Although that being said, that it's quite a free structure, there are small condensed sections perhaps showing sort of bits of groupings, how society has thoughts, but yet these have been fragmented, these have been disintegrated. So our beliefs, about what's really important have disintegrated, like the verses. I'm trying to think what else I want to say about this, really. I mean, I think it's, it is a complex poem, and there are parts of it that are really ambiguous. But again, I think this is why it works if we apply it to what is going on in the world right now. The fact that it's not necessarily just about the World Trade Center attacks in 2001, although contextually, and we're not marked on context, well, contextually it is, actually we could use this to apply to any sort of disastrous situation, so sort of reassess and take stock of what really is important.